Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So great to see you all. My name is Claire Balboni. I'm an assistant professor of economics here at the LSE. I'm also part of the organising committee of LSE's Environment Week, on behalf of whom I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this evening's event. So the LSE Environment Week concludes today. This is the end of our third annual Environment Week conference, which brings together academics, policymakers, students interested in and working across a very broad range of environmental topics. So we've had a terrific program. We've had more than 30, I think, academic presentations. We've had 4 master lectures. We've had 3 public events, and we're really delighted to be concluding this year's program with this hugely topical and important discussion of water pollution. So I will hand over to Swati Dhingra to introduce today's event. So Swati is a professor of economics here at the LSE and an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee, and then it will be chaired by Steve Machin here, who is a professor of economics and also the director of the Centre for Economic Performance here at the LSE. So very much looking forward to this evening's discussion.
Great. So with that, I'm going to show you a set of slides, mainly as a way of telling you what the key problems are, what the sewage crisis is about, so that many of you who may not be quite sort of up to date with all the news stories, you'll get a broad overview. So let me start with a very straightforward, this is over a long period of time, since the 2000s. What you can see here is that there's been a consistent drop in the number of serious water pollution incidents in England. At some point, though, it has leveled off, and this is really where the big sort of questions are coming in. If we compare that period when it's leveled off, so this is from 2016 to 2021, as to how the UK fares compared to other countries, on a number of various metrics, we look somewhat worse. Not compared to every European country, but definitely compared to the European average. So here, from lighter parts mean, the light gray bits mean you have reasonable water quality for your rivers and surface water, while the darker bits show you what are really poor, bad quality water areas. And you can see the UK looks somewhat more dark than the other places that you can see on this map, on this pie chart. What has also happened at the same time is that there's been a lot of sewage overflows from water and sewerage companies into the rivers, and this has been a source of real controversy and public scrutiny now. And one of the things that has come up is that there were commitments made that water companies would reduce their various sorts of pollution incidents by 50% from their 2012 levels, and most of them have not been able to meet those. In fact, we stand pretty far from being able to meet those. So the key question then is, how are we going to get to the point where we think the water quality of our rivers is sound enough for future generations? And one of the key problems with sort of solving this problem is that, we need huge investments, and that's going to be critical. Broadly, what has happened, 1989 is when the UK privatized the water companies, and there was low investment, and the hope was that with privatization would come higher investments by water companies, which would strengthen environmental quality and would also at the same time make them stronger in terms of their industrial capacity. That did happen early on, but again, there's been quite a leveling off. And at the moment, what's anticipated is that the UK needs, according to various reports, £56 billion up till 2050 to invest in the water companies to take care of some of these sewage problems. And also, the debt is somewhere above £60 billion even in 2023. So we're talking about big money. That's where LSE comes in, and we want to know how we can help with that situation. Broadly speaking, as far as bills are concerned, there's some expectation that those are going to rise, probably not to the level that water companies think is appropriate for the kinds of infrastructure investments that they want to make. But nonetheless, compared to a leveling off that happened in the recent past, we expect that going forwards, there's going to be some increase in water bills over time. And finally, let me leave you with how important this issue has become. So Danon here has been working on this issue with me. And we looked at how many news stories were there of sewage incidents happening being, sewage going into the waters in New York in the light gray line and London in the black line. And you see this really sharp pickup that happens in London, which is not something you're seeing sort of almost everywhere else in the world. This has also, of course, coincided with bigger fines in what Ofwat is putting as penalties on water companies. But the fundamental question that we're still left with is how we're going to finance the next few years of investments to take care of some of the legacy systems. We have a great panel, so I'll stop here, and Steve's going to take over from there.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. So evening, everybody, in the audience here and also online, and welcome to the LSE for this event entitled Sewage in Our Waters. So I've already been introduced as Steve Machin. I'm Professor of Economics and Director of the Centre for Economic Performance here at the London School of Economics. Just before we get going, there's a few housekeeping items to cover. One is that the discussion is being live streamed, and so we're recording today's session, and hopefully it will be made available as a podcast and a video. Of course, that's subject to no technical difficulties, but hopefully we'll be doing that. We're going to have designated time towards the end of the panel discussion to answer questions from both the audience here and to those who are connected remotely on the online activity. So for those of you who are joining online, there's also an option to type in questions, and we would encourage you to do that in the Q&A box, and we'll activate some of those questions from the Q&A box from the online observers when we get there. If you do that, please make sure to include your name and organisation and affiliation as well. You can also contribute to the conversation online. Indeed, people can possibly contribute to a conversation online here if they want to, by using the address hashtag LSE Events, where the LSE and the E on events are in capitals. I don't know if it's capital sensitive or not, but it may or may not be. And finally, for those people in the room, can you put your phones on silent? I better check I've done mine to avoid disrupting the event. So thanks very much for that. Okay, so I'm delighted to be chairing the event. What we're going to do in this session, we're going to discuss waste, in particular solid waste and sewage. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming our distinguished panellists, going from my immediate left over to the end. We first have Ed Conway, who's the Economics and Data Editor of Sky News. We have Kamala Dewar, who's a Senior Lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. We have David Henderson, who's Chief Executive of Water UK. And at the end, we have James Wallace, who's Chief Executive Officer of River Action. So the event's going to run for, 90 minutes, maybe 85 because of Swati's introduction. So first we're going to hear from Ed, who's going to give us some kind of perspective on the legacy systems, and I think he's going to discuss about investments when they needed to future-proof them in some kind of way. Next up on the list will be Kamala, who will give a perspective on international policy on waste flows and talk about the legal responsibility for investments that are made. A third will be David, who will give a perspective from the water industry about how firms plan to tackle storm overflows, deal with investments and corporate structures over the coming 5 years from 2025 to 2030. And lastly, James will give a perspective on the impact of sewage, agricultural pollution on health outcomes, water body health, and new powers and regulations of Ofwat and the environmental authorities. So each speaker is going to speak for 7 minutes, and then we'll have a moderated discussion following a Q&A session, which will come from the audience here and online. So all that said, Ed, the floor is yours to start.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's funny, isn't it? You come to a lot of these events and you sometimes quietly think to yourself, are all those people just talking crap? And this time, we literally are going to be talking about that because we're talking about sewage. But I'm more than anyone else, and generally speaking, talking crap because I'm a journalist. And so I'm not an expert in the same way that many of my fellow panelists are. But I did write a piece and make a film for Sky a little while ago about sewage, about water. And actually, I recently wrote a book which is kind of about certain substances which a lot of people think are boring and why they really matter for the global economy. And it strikes me, actually, the book's called Material World, but like the ultimate material really is water. I mean, it's such a fascinating topic. I was talking to Swati about this earlier. It's such a fascinating topic. And if you're looking for some sort of topic about a material that just is absolutely prevalent, is part of pretty much every kind of industrial or economic process you can think of, you know, from refining metals to making semiconductors, and yet we don't really properly work out the pricing and don't think properly about the sustainability of water. I mean, it is as big, if not bigger, an issue than carbon, and yet I don't think we discuss it enough. So it's a great topic. But as for sewage, I mean, in a sense, I have a kind of like a semi-shaggy dog story, really, more than deep analysis about this. But I think, for me at least, it really helped me understand about the problems with sewage, particularly in this country, particularly having looked at some of those fascinating charts in the presentation. Because we're thinking about this a lot, and there's been lots of talk about, you know, what are the big problems here? Is it about privatization? To what extent is it about investment? To what extent is it about other factors? But I think, you know, actually understanding the nature of the system, the nature of where the pipes go, is a really helpful starting point to this. At least it was for me. So if you want to understand why we're going through all these problems, why we have so many of these sewage overflows, why it's happening again and again, you need to understand the nature of the plumbing. And actually, in a sense, you need to understand, I told you I was going to be talking crap, you need to understand the nature of toilets and flushing toilets. So I used to think that the flushing toilet was one of the greatest inventions of humankind. But actually, think about the history for a little bit, and it's a slightly different story. So back before flush toilets, when people did their business, I'm sorry if this is all, you know, not what you're expecting in an LSE event. When people did their business, mostly they did it in cesspits in the bottom of their house, and the upshot was, you know, things were a little bit smellier than they were these days, certainly at the bottom of people's houses. And the cesspits gradually kind of built up with whatever goes inside. And from time to time, you'd have kind of people coming to empty the cesspits, and they'd take away what was inside and actually use it for fertilizer. So these cesspits were part of a kind of interesting economic system back in the day, and fertilizer was a relatively valuable thing. And then a couple of things happened. Those were not nice jobs, by the way. Night soil men were the jobs. People would come around and have to empty out the cesspits. It was an awful job, but nonetheless, part of an economic system at the time. And then a couple of things happened. So first of all, we discovered amazing resources of fertilizer on the other side of the world. So mineral fertilizer was discovered in Peru, in a place called the Chinchas Islands. You could get this amazing nitrogen-rich fertilizer by digging old bird dung, basically, off the rocks in Peru, and to some extent you could get minerals in Chile as well. What that did was that kind of depressed the going price for fertilizer, and so suddenly all of that stuff in the bottom of your cesspit wasn't worth as much. And the second thing that happened was obviously the flushing toilet. So, like I say, I used to think it was an amazing invention. The U-bend, the flushing toilet, the lavatory, it transformed our lives, but it also destroyed the cesspit economy. And as a result of this, all of these cesspits suddenly had a lot more water going into them, and that water started to kind of to seep out of those cesspits, because it couldn't be contained in them, and seep into the groundwater systems. Lo and behold, gradually, and we're talking about the kind of early 19th century, that contributed to some of the cholera outbreaks over the course of the following decades. So people were dying as a result of this, the flushing toilet. And so this became gradually a crisis in the UK, and indeed other countries around the world. There were cholera outbreak after cholera outbreak, and the sense that something needed to be done. And so there was a lively debate about, okay, we have this problem, we need to set up a sewage system. And we didn't really have, there were little micro sewage systems within different parts of London, for instance, but there was no kind of sewage system across London. And so everyone agreed that we needed some sort of a system. No one could quite agree on what kind of a system. There were some people, a guy called Edwin Chadwick, who you've probably come across as this reformer, Poor Laws, not a very nice guy, it turns out. But he had an idea, well, you take one pipe and you take away the sewage in one pipe. You take another pipe for the rainwater that goes down on the streets and off people's roofs. These days we would call that a separate system. Okay, 2 pipes. This is the key thing about the plumbing. 1 pipe, 2 pipes. And what you would do, and the reason this he thought was a great idea, was you could then sell the sewage for fertilizer. Okay, so it has this kind of economic basis to it. The problem, of course, was, as you've just heard, the fertilizer market had been destroyed, or at least prices had been massively depressed by the discovery of this guano on the other side of the world. And so that idea would involve much more capital investment because you need 2 pipes, and also it wasn't really going to work because the fertilizer wasn't as lucrative as it was before. The upshot of all of this was that it was an alternative system which won out during this kind of long debate, and it was the system that famously Sir Joseph Bazalgette was the great architect of in London. This is a combined system. So rather than having 2 pipes, one for sewage, one for rainwater, you would have one big pipe, a combined system, and everything goes into it. So think about the system in London. When you see a drain, that water is going down into the sewer, but also the stuff when you flush your loo is also going down into that sewer. And the thing about a combined system is it is designed to overflow when there is a lot of rain. If you think about it, it's having to contain not just the sewage, but it's also having to contain a lot of rain. And when there is a big rainstorm, it's going to overflow. And it's very, very hard to think of a way of taking that system and making it so it doesn't occasionally overflow. And when we say overflow, by the way, there's a lot of talk about, is there some evil person with a button somewhere in one of these water companies who decides every so often, right, we're going to send some sewage into the sea? No, it doesn't kind of work like that. I mean, understanding that this is a system that is ill-equipped to deal with massive flows of water from the rain is a better way of kind of thinking about the architecture of this. But of course, that system that Joseph Bazalgette built in the, kind of the 1800s, I think 60s or 70s, was an amazing sewage system. To the extent that we still obviously use it in London today, it was an amazing system to the extent that it helped prevent a lot of cholera in London. And this success of this system meant that when other people around the world were thinking, well, what do we do with our cities? When people in other parts of the UK, when people in the east coast of the US were thinking, what kind of a sewage system are we going to have to replace our cesspits? Most people went for the same kind of system. So Britain, and obviously at that time was the biggest economy in the world, we exported this combined system around the world. And as I say, it's hard to kind of understand the nature of the, I wouldn't say intractable, but incredibly expensive problem we're faced with today without just understanding it is about pipes. We chose a system. Had we gone for the Edwin Chadwick model of a separate system back then, things might have been different, because right now, what is the system when people talk about we need to sort our sewage out? What is the system that everyone is recommending? It is exactly that. It's a separate system with 2 pipes. And so all of which is to say, you, I'm sure, are all familiar with the kind of notion of path dependency. Well, within sewage, we have a really good example of path dependency, not just for the UK, but across the world, in that we committed ourselves to this at the time, amazing investment. But it turns out it might have been the wrong system. And we are now in the throes of trying to work out what to do about that. And unfortunately, if you wanted to throw out our combined system and replace it with separate systems, you are talking about such a monumental investment. I mean, to dwarf the figures that Swati was talking about a moment ago, you're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds. And so this is troublesome and it's problematic. That being said, my final point, I think there is something kind of also interesting about this, which tells a broader lesson about, I think, us as a nation in particular. When we have a kind of when we're bequeathed quite an effective bit of infrastructure, we're quite good at just using it for a long time and never really, replacing it. And I do wonder, this is a somewhat unrelated point, but in the research for my book, I kind of found myself at this factory, which used to be an ICI factory, where they take salt and turn it into soda ash and sodium bicarbonate. And the machines they're using in this factory are 100 years old. And they're still using these machines because they're kind of good enough to do the job. And I do think a lot of this overhang of underinvestment in this country, does it owe something to the fact that we in the Victorian period, and to some extent in the Edwardian period, did masses and masses of investment. We did in sewage, but we did it in our industrial base as well. And it was kind of just about good enough to keep us going in the future. And as a result, we have never really had that opportunity, if that's the right word, to start to reinvest and rethink about what these systems should involve. But the upshot of all of which is that we're left with a sewage system that is extremely archaic and does have some lessons for the rest of the world, both good and bad as well.
Great, thanks. Cameron?
Thank you. When I was looking at what I was going to talk about tonight, I was thinking I work on international transboundary issues, global governance issues. And I was thinking, well, our sewage is going into other people's water. And we know that there have been some complaints from the French, there have been complaints from the Irish on nuclear waste. And I was thinking, so what does another country do if our sewage goes into their waters or affects them? So I was looking at this French complaint in 2022, and they asked, 3 MEPs asked the Commission to investigate the large spills of untreated water that are occurring in the UK and polluting the Channel and the North Sea. And I was thinking, well, what law can they invoke? And the most obvious law there is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And there, under that, that's applicable to land-based sources of pollution that go into the sea as well as sea-based. So it was quite pioneering in the fact that they actually separated out these different flows to that extent, those different flows of pollution. And under this convention, states, including the United Kingdom, not the United States, they haven't signed up to this, they are required to take measures to prevent, reduce and control pollution from land-based sources, including rivers, estuaries, pipelines and outfall structures, taking into account international agreed rules, standards and recommended practices and procedures. So you think, well, actually the UK has signed up to this. What's happening with all of this law? The trouble is, there's very little guidance. It's very vague, this convention. It's very little guidance on what these rules and standards are. There are no time frames for adopting them, and there's nothing to say that states have to actually give legal effect to these international standards. And so practically, it doesn't really give much to those who want to push, who want to push the UK into doing something and addressing this. They also have, in all international law, you'll find that there is deference to sovereignty and sovereign decision making. And that means that the UK or the signatory state itself has to enforce the rules that they make and the definitions that they create and take other measures that are necessary. So that means that the UK actually defines its own laws, defines its own standards, and if there are international standards, the UK has a choice of whether to implement them, but there's no force on that. So actually we have this sovereignty concern permeating what is now a global problem. So what do you do? There are other conventions as well. There's OSPAR, which is particularly about North Atlantic waters. But the same problem happens. This is very soft power. This is diplomatic. If the French have a problem with the UK, they will sit down and they'll have a discussion. They'll ask for data sharing, but there's very little legislative push or enforcement mechanism because states haven't given that power to those bodies. So those two pieces of legislation are very interesting, but they're not actually forcing the UK to do anything. There's one other, which was also invoked in this investigation, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the post-Brexit UK-EU trade agreement. Now, there are environmental provisions in that. There's an environmental chapter, and they have this. The European Commission was worried that the UK would sort of roll back its standards to become more competitive internationally because it had lower standards. And so they have what they call the level playing field provisions for environmental standards. So under this agreement, the UK should not be diluting or rolling back its standards post-Brexit in order to have some kind of competitive advantage in any way. So this sounds okay, maybe we've got some teeth from this. If the UK is actually rolling back its standards and it's affecting the European Commission, maybe they can invoke a panel and have a dispute under this trade agreement. However, the benchmark is so high, the rolling back of the legislation or the dropping of standards has to be something that affects the trade or investment under the agreement. So it can't just be a rolling back. You actually have to find where's the red line, where's the cause here, and where's the effect. If there's no effect, you can't have a case. Now, so then I started thinking, well, investment. Now we're not just talking about affecting fishers, or affecting beach and tourism, we're talking about investment as well. And investment disputes actually have got some quite interesting things to say, not necessarily positive. So investor-state dispute settlement. Very controversial because a lot of people think that it takes away the rights of governments to regulate and it sort of puts the balance of power in favour of investors. And we do have some disputes in the past, a very famous one, the Vattenfall dispute in Germany, where this Swedish company took the Germany to investor-state dispute settlement because Germany had put in more stringent environmental standards for water and waste into water. And the company said, actually, you're affecting our investment here. And obviously NGOs, environmentalists were horrified by the idea of a company can come out and tell Germany that they can't raise their standards for water and water treatment. Well, the trouble with investor-state dispute settlement mechanism is not transparent, it's not based on precedent, past cases, and so we don't really know what happened. What we do know is that Vattenfall continued to operate under a permit that was, license that was given by the German government. So therefore, in some way, there was some negotiated settlement that allowed Vattenfall to carry on operating, and it must have been in Vattenfall's interest, otherwise they would have pursued more claims. Another interesting case for the UK is Tanzania, Bywater Tanzania. Tanzanian government was ordered by the World Bank and other international institutions to actually upgrade its water and sewage infrastructure and services because they were just blatantly inadequate. The Tanzanian government put a contract out, and a UK company called Bywater won that contract. Unfortunately, it was a disaster. There was massive mismanagement, there was poor performance, and the company Bywater said, look, we have to renegotiate this contract because we can't make any money at all. We didn't think it through. Can we renegotiate this? And Tanzania actually agreed to renegotiate it, but they never found a solution. And so there was more disputes, and there were two-track disputes. In one dispute, Bywater won, and in another one, Tanzania won and was awarded £3 million in damages. So I think what I'm trying to say from this is governments have a variety of pressures, and a lot of concern is about investors or investment saying, you are changing your standards here, and suddenly I'm not making the profits that I expected when I came in and signed this agreement. And this is causing what they say is regulatory chill on governments. They're scared that they're going to invoke a dispute with investors. So again, we come back to the UK government. International law cannot force the UK government to do anything. Investors can bring a case against the UK government if they do change their standards and make it harder. Stops with the UK government, which is why this is a nice place to pass this over to my colleagues here to talk about what can we do to make the UK government enforce its own regulations, because there are rafts of rules. It's about enforcing them.
Thank you. Hi everyone, it's very good to be here. So I suppose and first of all I should apologise for my voice. I've got a little bit of a cold and spent quite a lot of the last few days talking to the government at late hours of the morning at the conference in Liverpool about this very subject. And the first thing I normally do when I'm in these moments is to reiterate the apology that the industry offered last year, and that's because we understand we got it wrong. We were far too slow to keep up with public expectations on this topic, far too slow to understand the need to fulfil the obligations that are placed on the industry, and I think we understood that we had really missed the sort of shifting sands on this topic. Having done that, we've put forward a plan. We think it's the world's most ambitious plan to reduce this topic, which Ed has rightly said is a common feature of many of the world's sewage systems that sadly mixes rainwater with wastewater. And one of the reasons why we're able to have confidence in this plan delivering is that we are literally the only country in the entire world that monitors the activation of combined sewage overflows. So it's really interesting to me that there are MEPs in France that think that the sewage that might wash up on the beaches of Normandy has come from England, because France, first of all, can't tell you how many overflows they have, literally no idea, and they absolutely certainly cannot tell you how often they're operating. Whereas in this country, as of the end of last year, we can, because the last government put in compulsory metering of every, or sort of monitoring of every overflow. It's not volume, it's just the duration, but that is enough to tell us with some degree of precision how often these things are working. I was in Paris for the Olympic Games, and when it rained, people could see that there was sewage in the Seine, so the triathlon had to be postponed and the preparation sessions were cancelled. They only knew that because of what they could measure by taking instruments into the Seine. The actual overflows into the Seine are not monitored, and that's in the capital. So we are the only place that can tell how often this stuff is happening, and as a result, we know where it's happening far more often than in other places. And so the last government, has actually increased the standards. It's the Storm Overflows Reduction Plan. We can critique it far and wide, and I'm very happy to do that, but it did put a statutory obligation on companies to increase the investment to ensure that these overflows are operating far less often than they should be. It's before the regulator at the moment, that's called Ofwat, which is for England and Wales. It's the investment program to fulfil that plan and meet a whole raft of other conditions placed on companies for the next 5-year period. And we're a bit sad at the moment because we put forward a near doubling of investment, and I should explain what that investment is to do. It's essentially to do two things. It's to stop as much rainwater getting into the system in the first place, and that's by having what's called sustainable drainage systems, because we want to, the more rainwater that gets in, it's much harder to stop the overflows from happening, and we need to build much greater capacity in our sewage treatment works. That means holding rainwater so that when it stops raining very heavily, it can slowly go into the sewage treatment work and be treated. We also have additional standards being put on our sewage treatment works. So that plan's with Ofwat. It's a near doubling of investment, and their proposal that they've suggested they will impose is to cut that by nearly 20%. In some parts of the country, the northwest rather, it's a 40% cut. And we're very worried about that because if those cuts are confirmed, then we're not going to see the sort of investment that we desperately need. I know there's a lot of frustration about the companies. They certainly haven't got it all right. But in terms of the standards being enforced, yes, the Environment Agency and Ofwat and other regulators have been starved of funding, and we've done nothing but support reinstatement of those funds, and in fact an increase in those funds. We do not, like, this system is not working. Nobody works for a water company is happy reading the press reports. Nobody wakes up and gets out of bed each day and thinks, I'm going to ensure we have more sewage going into the waterways. Companies are not making money from this system. I can assure you that. 5 companies made a loss last year. Average returns are about 3%. It's less than you get in a high street bank right now. This is not a system awash with cash. In the past, I think it's fair to say there was less than ideal behaviour. I mean, we're sort of talking 10, 15 years ago in some companies where returns were abnormally high. But even if you added up every single dividend paid across every single company since privatisation, you get to about 70 billion. That's a lot of money. That is a lot of money. But it's not even 3/4 of the investment program for the next 5 years. And if you had a state-owned system, which we do in Scotland and Northern Ireland, where the challenges, I can assure you, are precisely the same, the government would have to pay interest on the debt that it would borrow to fund that investment. So I get it makes people uncomfortable to think of a privatised absolute monopoly. We do have the system that we have. There are debates about whether we should spend scarce resources not on the NHS, not on our defence forces, not on education, but buying back the assets. And of course there are pros and cons with that. But if we did that, we would still then, as the state, have to put forward vast sums to get this system up and running. The whole program of investment we're putting forward as an industry is 105 billion over the next 5 years. As I say, Ofwat has cut it left, right and centre, and we're very worried about that, because if those cuts are confirmed, we may not have the investors willing to put forward the cash to make the investments that we need. We spend a lot of time talking about wastewater, and I get the reasons why. Nobody wants to see sewage in the rivers and seas. The investment has gone up, as was acknowledged at the start, in real terms since privatisation. That has delivered quite a lot of improvements. There's less phosphorus, less nitrates. We actually have sewage being treated in large parts of the country where we never had before. I mean, up until about 15 years ago, all sewage in Brighton just went straight into the channel. Now it's treated. But we have a lot more to do. And most of the activity actually that we need to do is at the water end of the business. I mean, frankly, we are running out of water. And increasingly, water is an absolute brake on economic development. Now, if there's one thing I know this government really wants to do, it's deliver economic growth. And they ain't going to get it unless they get more investment in our water supply. All these data centres that Peter Kyle, the Science Secretary, is very keen on having built require water to keep them cool. I mean, a lot of water. And we have not built a reservoir in 30 years. Not because companies have not tried to, companies have applied again and again and again and had those applications cut and rejected. To its credit, the Environment Agency, which used to have a point-blank policy of rejecting every single reservoir, has apologised for that and said it will no longer stand in the way of constructing reservoirs. And thank goodness, because the 1.5 million homes the government wants to build are going to require a lot of water, as will these data centres. So that's where the vast proportion of the 105 billion that we're hoping to have approved for investment will flow. And finally, I should say, companies want to invest. It is only by investment that a return is permitted by the regulator. And it's from that return that dividends and everything else is paid. And at the moment, those returns are very low. So we are very keen to invest a lot more. And there's a good reason why you have an independent economic regulator who scrutinises our plans and cuts them where they feel that they're inefficient, or cuts them where they feel that we're going above and beyond what we're required to do. Because people have to pay for that investment ultimately through their water bills. But as we also saw, since 2010, bills have broadly fallen in real terms. If they've merely risen with inflation since 2010, they'd be about 15% higher. Look, it's never a good time to raise bills, probably least of all now, and I understand for many people increasing their water bills will be very painful. So as part of our proposals with the regulator, we are wanting to triple the level of support to vulnerable customers, payment holidays, discounts on water bills. Some people get free water. Some people have medical needs for a lot of water, and we don't think they should be incurring any of these increases. And if we could be even more generous with those support schemes, we absolutely would. In fact, that's one of the things we've put forward to Ofwat, is to go even further than tripling the support to vulnerable customers. So there's a lot to do. We are stuck, I'm afraid, with a system that does mix rainwater and wastewater. We are very, very keen to get on with it, I can assure you, and we're hopeful that this new government will want to see that investment flow. And then, once we've done that, we need to look at the entire system, because the whole regulatory, industrial, legislative policy system is broken. It is just not working at all, and it needs a complete root and branch reform. And we are in the market for the most radical ideas possible on how to do that, because it's really not working at the moment.
Okay, thanks. James?
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm not an economist. I'm not a lawyer. I do agree the current system is broken, and by that I mean both the regulatory and finance system. And because we have a geographic monopoly here and an industry that was privatised, without that effective regulation, then it was inevitably going to go the way it was. Markets do what markets do. Investors do what investors do. Unfortunately, we're talking about the lifeblood of our land, our bodies, our homes, our livelihoods, every single thing that we rely on, our food production, our industry, cooling, IT rooms. So where's it gone wrong? Well, I think we've heard a certain amount of that so far this evening, and I would concur with much of what's been said. What's the impact? Well, to say that many of our rivers, our waterways, our lakes, streams, ponds and coastlines are facing environmental collapse is not an exaggeration. There have been improvements in some respects. We do not have the industry we used to have, but simply the vanishing of that industry has cleaned itself up. Although, of course, there are certain things like mining that have, historic mining, that do still have a considerable impact. There's a very considerable impact too of agriculture. It was mentioned briefly earlier. Agriculture is definitely a very big risk to, when I say agriculture, I'll rephrase that. Unregulated, intensive industrial agriculture is what I'm talking about, where the waste from that industry is treated very much as a waste rather than a resource. And if we characterise the west and the east of the country, we can broadly refer to the east as being arable intensive and reliant heavily on imported fertilisers, and the west as being, and therefore in deficit, if you like, of nutrients, and the west being in surplus. What do we see in the west? Typically, the muck spread on fields, often where it's not needed, washed into rivers, eutrophication, algal blooms, ecological death. Look at the River Wye. Why is that not being used as a resource to help those farmers on the east, that rather than spend a fortune and also a high carbon budget for importing fertilisers? So a very considerable lack of intelligent system solution that we could easily implement. This is not the proverbial rocket science. It's really basic. So we then must look at, as well, with nutrient pollution, that there's nutrients from sewage too. And there are much more ambitious targets for for cleaning up the phosphate levels, for example, I believe around 80% by 2038, which is very much to be encouraged, and there are signs of improvement. However, if we look at permits for water companies, most of them have not been reviewed for literally decades. And what many people in the room may not be aware of is that the final treated effluent for sewage treatment companies and wastewater treatment plants and so on do not have a requirement under law to issue water that is, I'm not suggesting it would be drinkable, but non-polluting. So it's full of microplastics, full of chemicals that come from our own bodies when we imbibe them ourselves, whether they're hormones related to birth control, for example, cocaine, and those sorts of things. There are literally frogs and other animals in our waterways full of these drugs. So again, a very considerable issue. And then we have pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and so on. If we use E. coli as an indicator of ill health, if you like, many wastewater treatment plants with their final treated effluent, I'm not talking about storm overflows, I'm talking about normal treated effluent, are absolutely loaded with really dangerous pathogens. So this is normal, this is business as normal in this country. Unless you happen to have a fishery downstream, or you extract for water, or you have bathing water status, which should be, incidentally, recreational status, then you're not going to have a permit that requires you to clean it up. So actually, you can't really blame water companies for that because the law doesn't require them to do it. It should change, and it should not change necessarily the same in everywhere, but it should change, particularly in places where human health are at risk or there's a major ecological impact. That's common sense to me. Let's look at the money. So when we look at water companies, we're often being told, and we see in the press, of the cost of, for example, special administration. Now, as I said, I'm not an economist or a lawyer, but I rely on people who I trust who are, say, for example, Professor Ewan McGaughey and David Hall, both very well respected and produce much peer-reviewed papers on these subjects. And I'm assured by them that if we use Thames Water as, again, an indicator of ill health and a failed system, then there is every reason to suggest that we could put an organisation like that into special administration. When I say we, I mean Steve Reed, the Secretary of State, has it within his power to apply to the High Court for special administration without costing us anything. Now, I absolutely come at his point there about potential legal ramifications. There may be some risks there, but as far as the Water Industry Act is concerned, the Secretary of State has it within his or her powers to put a failing water company that is at risk of being insolvent and not delivering upon its licence requirements into special administration. That means they can take all equity and own it, that's us, the public, and that they can write off all debt. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the solution, it's just a fact of law. And it may be disputed on the panel here, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm telling you now, and I'm happy to put my reputation, I believe that that is true. Now, there are lots of different ways of interpreting this. I'm not suggesting for a moment we renationalise the whole industry. I'm just using Thames Water as an example of something that clearly doesn't work. The system doesn't work, and the source of finance does not work. Hence the situation we're in. So, is there a halfway point? The government, understandably, very concerned about the potential legal action that Kamal has referred to and the bond market, the debt market tanking. And I totally understand that. And again, I'm not advocating for, and I think most of the people that I engage with do not advocate for a carte blanche renationalisation of the industry. However, we cannot have more years of bad money after bad without the proper regulatory systems in place and the sorts of money that we're attracting and have done typically. When we talk about, and Dave, if I may refer to you, your point now about the water industry not making money in recent terms, that's referring to shareholder dividends. What happens with debt and the coupon rate on debt, interest payments, is totally unknown. Nobody knows it. Well, maybe some people do, but certainly not the public and academics I talk to. So, for example, if you're looking at the cost of debt in Thames Water, it might be 8 or 9 or 10%. It might be a lot more than that. I don't know. But if the government had a special administration process, and let's say they took 50% of that debt, and I'm a Thames Water bill payer, I reckon roughly, according to various estimates, about a third of my bill is to service debt for not getting my service and for breaking the law and killing wildlife and putting human health at risk. If you were to replace that with government-backed bonds, then the coupon rate would halve or more. We're talking about 4.5%, 5%. That is highly attractive to the international bond market. So rather than put people off, it will attract things in. Why? Because it's government-backed, and it's underwritten and securitized by our bills. So I'm using that as just an example here, that we can do things differently. We can also look, as you're referring to, Kamala, across the pond. We can look at Europe. If you look at charts that are colour-coded that show the different forms of investment structures that are being used across Europe, they literally cover everything from not fully privatised, because we are the only one, but a blend of nationalised, mutualised, municipalised, public-private partnerships and all sorts of different things. So as far as what our asks are as an organisation and many campaigners around us, we feel that with the new government in place, we have hope. We are very pleased to see that there is one bill already, the Water Special Measures Bill. We are hopeful that a review that the Secretary of State has announced will be rapid and look systemically, as I think all panellists here are agreeing that we need to have that review done. And that we, in the meantime, using perhaps the water bill, use the opportunity to perhaps, for example, give Ofwat an environmental duty, which currently doesn't exist. Instead, it has a duty to give reasonable returns to shareholders. How about swapping them? And when it comes to looking at special administration, the current trigger, the threshold, is predominantly a financial one and whether the service is being met. But that's, again, not down to whether they're polluting. So how about putting that in? So there's some very simple measures that could be done that could send a firm message to the industry to clean up its act. We think put Thames Water into special administration would be a great first step, and to demonstrate there's a better way of doing it, and to think really intelligently, and I have to emphasise, to work together. I'm just giving my own view, but I hope that I'm not coming across as someone who's got a fixed view on what should be done. There are lots and lots of different ways of doing it. Let's look across at Europe. Let's look at Copenhagen, for example. Let's look at Berlin, where they have much cleaner water than us. Copenhagen, you can literally dive into any waterway in the city. It's well known for it. We could aim for that too. So my final point is, let's work together between sectors and industries, and let's help those that are currently perceived as villains, whether they are a water company boss, a regulator, a past government, and so on, as heroes. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, so now we're going to have a bit of a discussion. I'm going to ask a few questions. Some picking up on what's been spoken about already, some perhaps trying to get views of each of the panellists on these particular issues. So we could, if you can't hear me, we could. Is that better? Yeah, that is obviously far better. I'm obviously sitting too far back. Okay, thanks for that. So I guess the international angle. So there's been a few quite interesting observations here, I think, both in terms of the initial presentation, but also in terms of what's been said by various other panellists. So I guess, how does the state of our waters compare to peer countries? On the reflection, it looks like it's pretty poor, but we've heard discussions about actually we're better at collecting data and monitoring the situation than other countries are. And so is it really to do with the legacy systems that's going on here, or is it something else? We've also heard that the kind of means by which sewage is dealt with are rather similar across countries. And sort of why did the trend down sort of stop from picking up on one of Swati's charts? I'll come to that when we come to the companies a bit more as well on my next question. But I guess can we really establish that that's the case, that it really is worse and it's been getting worse? Or is it just that the data's not so good from elsewhere and the monitoring systems are not so good? Who'd like to pick up on first?
Can I answer that? The industry is essentially in two halves. There's drinking water and there's wastewater. Drinking water, we are regularly attested by the World Health Organization as being joint 6th highest in the world. There's a reason why if you go to France or Spain or Italy, the supermarket aisles are filled with bottled water because people don't trust the quality of what comes out of the tap. That's not the case here. So drinking water, I think it's very hard to find anyone who disagrees with that. The Drinking Water Inspectorate, which is a very little-known regulator, does an extremely good job. Wastewater is a different story. We're about middle of the pack around Europe, and our bills are about middle of the pack. With Denmark, you're right. Denmark has 4th stage sewage treatment. In this country, we have 3rd. 4th stage takes out pharmaceutical residue and it takes out cosmetic residue, and their bills are almost double the average of here. Switzerland has it too. The European Union is introducing a compulsion on member states where there's sewage treatment works serving more than 2,000 people to bring it up to the standard of Denmark and Switzerland. Because of our Brexit withdrawal agreement, Northern Ireland is obliged to follow that, and Scotland and Wales have said that they are almost certain to follow that new requirement. England, to our UK government, we're the only ones that have not indicated. I can't imagine the UK government will tolerate having much higher standards than the rest of us. And so Curiously, or I think fantastically actually, the European Union is making 90% of that extra cost fall onto the cosmetic and pharmaceutical giants. It is at the very last stage. Now, some of the big pharmaceutical companies are trying to push back, but it's too late. It's gone through the Council and the Parliament and the Commission, so it's essentially law. I want us to have the Danish system, but it's going to cost. Like, I'm afraid these things do cost. And but you're right. I mean, we know the pharmaceutical residue is really not great. We don't want hormone and endocrine modifiers into our environment. But it's the fourth stage. I mean, I've seen it. It's very complicated stuff. It is not cheap to achieve.
Actually, I went to Copenhagen. We seem all to be talking about Denmark. I went there to look at their water system, and it is in parts kind of amazing because I was talking earlier about the gold standard for the sewage system, which we don't have, is this separate system of rainwater going down one pipe and sewage going down the other. I saw one place in Copenhagen where I think they have a three-way separation. So you have the rain from the roof, that's one pipe, the rain from the roads, that's another pipe, and then the sewage is another pipe entirely. But it is expensive, and it's worth saying as well, Denmark used to have, well, in fact, in most of Copenhagen still does have the same system that we have. So it has a combined system for most of Copenhagen, and even there, this kind of the promised land for water that people kind of go to, including journalists looking to find out where the promised land of water is. It's Denmark, it turns out. Even there are still kind of spots where it's the old-fashioned kind of troublesome thing, and so they're building a big pipe through Copenhagen that's very similar to the Thames Tideway Tunnel that we have in the UK. But the reality with the Tideway Tunnel is that will not stop a few overflows happening a year. We will still, this is one of the most actually amazing engineering projects that we've had in this country recently. I kind of go on about how we don't invest enough. Actually, the Tideway Tunnel is an amazing project. But even with that in place, there will still be some overflows. And so I do wonder if part of this is, that fascinating chart that Swati showed about suddenly interest in this and concern about it has gone through the roof. Is it post-COVID? Is it this enthusiasm for swimming in rivers? Particularly amongst a kind of intelligent and connected subset of the population. But if people are kind of hoping for this immaculate world where you're never going to occasionally, if you're unlucky, see something that you don't want to see floating in the water, the scale of cost to get to that is just beyond belief. And what's interesting here is about the cultural shift from a world where we just didn't care about this, that. Maybe we didn't care about it. Maybe we just didn't measure it. We just weren't measuring it, and we were kind of occasionally swimming in it. To one where we're kind of thinking about it a lot more. I mean, that's obviously awareness is a good thing, but understanding what the immaculate system would evolve is also quite important.
Great. And so
Would you like to say anything? I'd like to add something, but would you like to?
Please,
You sure? Would you mind if I did?
Yeah, of course.
As far as your point about the comparisons abroad, so if we use bathing water status, then and if we're looking at the indicators comparable to, say, France and Britain, in England we have 15 certified bathing sites inland. In France, we have 573. So when we see our stats on bathing water, they're predominantly seaside, and they are rated well into the 90%, and that is why it's so high. But the 3 sites that were the only ones that had bathing water status until this summer were all unsafe to swim in. And I suspect that when the testing is done by the EA by the end of this season, which is around now, we'll see the same from many of the others. So when it actually comes to being in the water, there's a very considerable risk. But I will add, though, there is another issue here that we have to judge as to how important being in water is compared with having sewage overflows and drinking water and so on, because unfortunately some people will not necessarily think, well, they might think, well, I don't swim in the river and I don't have a dog that might get sick, or my child, I don't actually go near a river, and therefore why should my bill go up, and so on. So there's an additional question there. I think that'll do for the moment. I've got other things to say, but I can come back to them.
Okay, so let me move on a little bit. So we've obviously had discussions about the scale of the investment, and people talking about ownership structures and management hindering investment, and therefore environmental neglect occurring. I guess there's also the question about, is it the right investment, even if it is not to the scale that you might want it to be, and maybe scaling it up, if possible, through various means that we've spoken about, could be good. But is it going to be on the right things, and in particular, on the innovation side of things as well? I think the industry is not doing very good in terms of R&D investments, and certainly relative to the past. And I mean, this is true, of course, of many other sectors in the economy, and has been since at least the last 15 years. When investment rates have fallen massively. But, you know, is it that the balance of the spending on investment is going to the right things, or should it be more towards R&D and innovative activities, but are going to try and think about technologies that can be adopted to try and get around some of the problems, especially if we are in this position where it's the system, the structure of a system that's constraining things as well. Surely some form of innovation would need to be a kind of way to think about going forward. And so, is the investment giving a good return for the amount of it? But also, is it the right investment, I think, is an important question.
Given we're in the London School of Economics, and as someone who studied economics 25 years ago, one of the issues that I think explains in part why we're in this mess is that we've had a lot of classical economic thinking, particularly at Ofwat, about how to structure the system, which classical economics assumes rational expectations, perfect information, zero transaction costs, and it's a standard definition of perfect competition. And given we have literally the antithesis of that with a collection of absolute monopolies, we have regulators trying to force in theories of perfect competition. So we have very, very, very elaborate mechanisms by which companies are ranked against each other, incentives put in place to outperform one another, and it's all designed to replicate the market, and it doesn't work. So on top of that, we have a lot of, love them dearly, but sort of engineers who think very rationally about the world, and they think about the question you just asked: what would the most efficient allocation of a scarce pound? And would it be to reduce an overflow? If you're interested in the environmental outcome, no, it would not. You'd send a check to the farmers and ask them to use a different fertiliser or to stop the slurry runoff. But in a democracy, people get to decide what's the most important, and the people have well and truly decided that they do not want sewage overflowing to the rivers. So we're going to spend that money to fix it. But if you were thinking about what's the most economically rational thing to do, you wouldn't be doing this. But in a sense, that's by the by. People do not want sewage in the rivers, and so they've got every right to have it stop. I think as we move through, I hope sooner rather than later, this sort of moment of crisis and acute frustration in society, and one of the things we're very encouraged by the new Secretary of State's decision to hold a comprehensive review that does bring in agriculture and housing and transport and all the other contributors to the pollution in our environment, is that we can start to have this conversation about what actually is the best use of money. And we would much prefer it, really, and it'd be much better for the environment, if we could have a kind of a collaborative assessment of the issues in any given catchment and look at what's the most effective way of reducing that pollution, and then send the money to the people who are going to be most able to affect the change in that area. And by and large, that will be the farmers. Not always, sometimes it'll be us, but it would be, and every time I talk to the national farmers about this, they're all in. They would much receive a check to use a better fertiliser, to upgrade the runoff of slurry into rivers, than not, and have us spend a fortune on capturing the rain, which is what we're going to do, to stop this overflows from occurring. It's kind of madness, but that will stop. It's highly diluted, but it is still untreated sewage from flowing as often. But even as you say, 4.5 billion super sewer that's about to open next year is not going to stop all the sewage overflowing into the Thames when there's torrential downpour.
It's also downstream as well, isn't it? So it's not going to fix the upstream.
No, it won't. That's right.
May I, have you finished?
Yes. Sorry.
Well, no. So, yes, I think also, though, we've also got to look at maintenance as well. I had a very interesting conversation with a senior exec from a water company last year who acknowledged that there was a very significant lack of skills as well. And I think she said to me something like, even if we had all the money, James, we still wouldn't be able to go and fix all the problems because we don't have the engineering skills and the numbers of engineers. And obviously I quipped back, well, if you had put the investment up front, then maybe we wouldn't be in that problem. However, this is where we are. So we don't have enough engineers, we don't have enough skills, we don't have a European deal that allows us to bring them from abroad, and if we train up at home, which we should do, then it's going to take a long time. So we have a really serious skills shortage that isn't often talked about. I know Lilla Thompson at British Water is very much an advocate for this. So if I'm not wanting to sound in any way blaming, I'm definitely trying to avoid that this evening, the water companies generally are not maintaining their infrastructure there. So your point about technology is that I would say let's focus on technologies that improve maintenance first so we can stop leakage. So for example, if we look at, you mentioned water security earlier and scarcity, we leak 4 billion litres of drinking water a day. And Thames Water, serving this area of London, leak 600 million a day. So how about, yes, of course we need reservoirs, yes, of course we need wetlands, but let's fix the leaks. And there are some really simple things. I was talking to a chief executive of a water company not long ago, and he was saying that they're looking into things like the old-fashioned radiator fill. Some of us who are old enough will remember adverts for Radfill. They're looking at whether you can literally just pump it upstream. I don't know if it will work. Some people use these sort of lining technologies. But that's definitely a place to innovate, because at the moment, just fixing the current leaks is massive and costing us bill payers a huge amount too.
Okay, great. And so you've anticipated, each of you has anticipated one of my questions about investment in skills and about whether there's too much focus on sewage discharges and not thinking about farming and agriculture and stuff as well. Let me go to Kamala to ask a bit more about sanctions and legislation as well. So, I mean, do we think the current outlook is, do we think the design of the kind of sanction structure and the regulation through fines and transparency and monitoring, is that the right way of thinking about things, targets, or can something else be done better in this kind of context to if you like, go towards the optimal punishment for behaviour if required, for bad behaviour if required?
Well, I think obviously you need to work out the incentives and disincentives, and so having a good fine structure and penalty structure is really important because it sends signals to the operators in this field. But that's not really the way you want it. You want to have a system where you don't have to rely on fining people or fining companies to get the outcome right. I was reading the Office of Environmental Protection's report, and they were saying that Ofwat is just not producing the data that they need. They were very concerned about, Ofwat's monitoring and data provision. So, it's more systemic than just sort of fining companies. And I think this conversation has shown that this is a really entrenched problem that needs to be looked at from a variety of angles. But what seems to be, from a legal perspective, is that there doesn't seem to be much pressure on the government. I mean, the government can put pressure on Ofwat, and Ofwat can put pressure on, various companies. But actually what is happening at a governmental level seems to be extremely reactive and risk-averse.
Does the nature of privatisation, like leaving aside all of the stuff about investment, does the nature of privatisation just mean finding the person who's responsible? Because it sounds like, the water companies are annoyed with Ofwat, and Ofwat's annoyed with, there's finding the person who is responsible for either that lack of investment or indeed the kind of shortcomings of the system. Is that just inherent to a privatised, regulated monopoly system like this with lots of different, actors like the Environment Agency, Ofwat, the companies?
Well, when I'm trying to sort of follow the kind of like the road towards who's responsible, it always goes back to the Secretary of State. And they're supposed to respond in 3 months, and they're supposed to do, and the idea that it all goes back to the Secretary of State seems a little bit weak to me, because I've never seen the Secretary of State, get publicly harangued and put into jail about something.
Well, I mean, the last Secretary of State lost his job because the government fell, and our analysis is about 40 seats fell as a direct result of this issue. So we do have a democratic means of accountability. But I mean, I represent Water UK, clues in the name, it includes Scotland and Northern Ireland. They are state-owned systems, and the challenges are precisely the same, because the system is the same. It combines wastewater and rainwater. I mean, if you want to see terrible sewage in the rivers, go to Belfast, because the government, the Democrat, subsidised by the UK government here in London, has completely starved that company of investment. I mean, it's really, you think it's bad here, It's really,
But there's
really...
no data on that.
Well, the data is that the development can't occur because the company doesn't have the means to take in the sewage. So any new development, you have to do a separate side agreement with the company and hope that if you write them a check, they'll be able to suggest that they've expanded their works enough to justify that development. So housing's not being built there anywhere near the way it should be. And there are there's not monitoring of every overflow, but there is measurement of the waterways. It's not as frequent or as probably as robust. So, but we do know that the overflows are activating far more often than they should be. I mean, as I said, like France, state-owned. This is a common problem. So I don't really think the ownership model is producing any different outcomes.
I think it's both. We've had decades of we could characterise as dirty money, and we now need clean money. We also have had decades of slowly but surely deregulating or reducing the regulatory enforcement behaviours of our government, and DEFRA has had, in fact, funding cut. It is absolutely true. But at the same time, flood budgets, for example, have remained quite healthy, if you like. But that's a lot of concrete pouring. But then you go back to the nature-based solutions side of things, and do we have enough wetlands? Do we have enough beavers, and so on? So when we're looking at the resourcing of environmental regulators, we also need to look at the skill set. I mentioned engineering too. Just for a moment on agriculture, I understand that many of the farm inspectors that go out to inspect farms are not trained, do not have something called facts basics. It's a nutrient management training, so you can assess the nutrient needs of that soil and crop and whether there's too much. They're not trained. They don't have data to help even understand the farm size, the cattle herd and their movements. Why is this? Because the Rural Payments Agency, who pay farmers, they own the data and they can't share it with the Environment Agency. Why? Because of apparently GDPR. So we have two regulators, two arm's length bodies who do not share data. That is the ludicrous world we live in. That can be resolved, not even a stroke of the Secretary of State's pen, because it's not needed. It is that simple. Another example is looking at the water industry. The punitive measures, obviously, actually I'll quickly say, on the farming side, the farming rules for water 2018 have never been used once for pollution. Not once. We took the Environment Agency to court not long ago for this very reason. And we believe that what we did as a campaign may have helped change that, although we're testing it at the moment. We've yet to see any further enforcement, any at all. If we look at the water industry, I believe absolutely in carrot and stick. We need both. If we look at the water industry, we've had fish kills, for example, by Thames Water and Southern Water, similar amounts of fish killed, so similar levels of pollution. And one took 6 years to prosecute, the other took 5 years. The one to Thames Water cost 3.3 million in fines levels. The one to Southern Water was 330,000, 10%. What does that say? It says to me, carry on polluting.
Okay, let's have one more question, and then we'll go to the Q&A from the audience. So let's this has been discussed a little bit. Let's revisit this question about whether, for consumers, whether passing on some of these issues in terms of higher prices and therefore higher bills is even necessary, and is it really fair? We've had some discussion. There was some discussion about maybe lowering bills for lower income individuals, almost like means testing in some sense of the bills, but that's not what we do in many other settings, particularly from private companies. So is the discussion about raising prices and putting bills up to try and fund future investments, is that the right way of thinking about it, or is there other things that could be done here as well? Who'd like to take that first?
Someone has to pay.
Absolutely.
It's not a charity.
Absolutely.
So either the taxpayer pays or private individuals pay. And we have a system in England, as I said, but the charges are the same. If you want this fourth stage treatment to get rid of cosmetic residue and pharmaceutical residue, it's going to cost. And in Denmark, the bills are about double of what they are here. So it depends on what we want as a society. But it's not going to come for nothing. As I say, you can get rid of every single dividend ever paid since privatisation, and it's not even going to cover 3/4 of the next 5-year investment programme. So we've kind of got to get real about this. It's like, what do we want? And I think we all want a clean environment, but it's not going to be free?
This may surprise you to hear this. I actually agree that bills are too low and that we've undervalued water, our lifeblood. However, to put them up requires a massive leap of faith for we consumers to trust the industry that has run rampant with our money. So if bills are going to be put up, there needs to be a very significant intervention from the regulator, from Ofwat and the Environment Agency for their own different roles to ensure that money is actually used for what it should be used for. And I think one of the ways of characterising it, which might sum it up, is that I, as a bill payer to Thames Water, are perfectly happy for them to put my bill up if it's going to help secure my daughter's water for the future. I have teenage girls. But if it's to clear up the mess from the past, I'm not happy with that. They've had the money, as some people have been known to say in the media, and I do not want to pay twice, as they say. However, we do undervalue this lifeblood of ours, and even if it was twice as much, it's still a massively less cost to a family than food, and water is just as important as food. So it's going to be a very considered and challenging effort for the government and for the water industry to try and rebuild that trust so that we, the bill payers, and as you say, as taxpayers too, because there's a cost in that respect too, to be able to put those bills up, in my view.
I would just say we as a country, and it's not just water, we as a country have underinvested for decades. State, private sector as well. We've underinvested in our infrastructure. We continue to underinvest in our infrastructure. Water's one part of that. And the upshot of this is that we don't have particularly good infrastructure when it comes to a lot of things, when it comes to our transport system, when it comes to, to some extent broadband, when it comes to various different bits of our energy infrastructure. So we do at some point have to, and I think there's an interesting semi-nuanced question with water about whether it's coming through bills, whether it's coming through taxation or elsewhere. But we as a nation have underinvested enormously for a long time, and we are seeing the economic consequences of that. And so we do need to work out how we can finance that infrastructure and investment, and we need to invest. But I think the other angle to this is that if we're going to be borrowing to invest in the future, we do also need to be aware that we are going to be borrowing a lot of that money from overseas. It is overseas investors, thanks to our current account deficit, who are financing a lot of this money. And so having a kind of seeming like a credible borrower is also pretty important right now.
And that's also why the productivity and growth agenda is very important, that the investment needs to be productive to generate. So it doesn't necessarily have to be passed on to consumers.
It doesn't have to be what?
It doesn't necessarily have to be passed on to consumers if you can get productivity up. But part of my question about the technology earlier was some of that, to get the water companies to be more productive in what they do. If you have better investment going into things that will generate future productivity and growth.
But we need to invest.
But we need to invest, yeah. But,
I would say,
including in skills.
For any given level of investment, though, there is, I think, an important discussion to be had about the way in which we charge. As we've moved away from rateable value, which essentially you pay depending on whether you're band, the landowner or the visitor's band, A, B, C, D, E, G, to meters. Meters is precisely the same price per unit of water, whether you're using 5 litres of water or 500 litres of water or 5,000 litres of water a day. And some of our companies are trialling schemes at the moment whereby people are, broadly speaking, given enough to live on, almost for free. And then if you want to use a fair bit more water than that, you pay reasonably. And then if you want to use a lot of water, like if you want to wash a car twice a day and have a huge garden full of tropical water-loving plants and they're looking fabulous all through summer, then you're going to pay very handsomely. And that's the sort of discussion I think it's warranted to have. I come from Australia in the state of Victoria, which went through a drought in 2001, 2002, happened to be working for the Water Minister at the time, and it forced a big discussion about this. And there are parts of the world like that have that sort of system, with due protections for people with large families or health reasons or religious reasons to need a lot of water. That's a very small part of society. Everybody else generally probably should not be paying the same amount of water if they've got an enormous garden as they live in a small flat in the centre of the city and just use enough to live on.
Okay, great. Let's move to a Q&A. So we're going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. We've got about 20 minutes. So can you say who you are and your organisation when we come? And we'll take about 2 or 3 questions in each turn. And then I'll ask the panellists to pick on what they would like to do. Danan's going to collect questions from the online audience, but we'll start, I think, with people in here. There's roving microphones that are going to come around. Your hand went up really fast, so you can go first. Who have the other hands?
Hi, my name's Joel. I'm studying a master's in environment and development. And yeah, thank you for coming to speak. And what it seems like the common message is that there's a kind of downward spiral in terms of there's been historically low investment, which means we've got a system that's failing, which means everyone finds a problem with it. Regulators are saying, companies aren't doing enough. And we need to break out of that downward spiral. And the question seems to be whether we can give investors the confidence that they can actually get a return. So at the moment, they're thinking, there's how are we going to break out of this system? How are we going to get a return? And I really like the sound of having a government-backed bond where, investors actually think, yeah, this is something I can be a bit more confident in. So I was wondering, seeing as you discussed with the government some policy ideas, whether they'd talked about anything similar.
Okay, there's one here. There's 2 there. We'll take and then.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Esme Stallard. I'm from BBC News. I cover this quite a lot, and it's really enjoyable to have quite a techie conversation about this. It's kind of a question for Kamala, but I guess anyone might want to come in on it. Is you spoke about the government kind of implementing the law. What happens when they don't understand or necessarily are sure of their own law? And I just give an example at the moment where Ed talked about we have a combined sewage system. We're allowed to kind of use our overflows when it rains a lot. So in this country, we're not allowed to spill when there's dry weather. And what constitutes a wet weather event? Well, under government guidance, it's 0.25 millimetres. Now, they established the OEP, which is an independent body, which under law, which has said, actually, maybe you got that wrong. So what happens now if they then do what the OEP said, because they have to under law, but then water companies have a right to come back and say, yeah, but you told us previously it was 0.25 millimetres. And I guess a question to David is if they change the law and say, actually what we're going to do is say that you can only spill if it's an extreme weather event. How do you prepare for an extreme weather event? What does that look like under climate change? What are kind of water companies doing to prepare for that? Because I guess that's changing all the time.
Hi, my name is Richard Davison. I'm an academic here at the LSE. Great conversation, thank you. On the downward spiral and how sort of doom and gloom we are, one good thing, I think, is that expectations have clearly shifted. If historically people, in the 1800s, people had wanted to get to the south of London, they could have gone by river. London was full of rivers, and we just filled them all in. So, part of the fact that this is a shift in expectations, I think, is something we should welcome. But I wanted to really press you on what you think the model should be. So we have Northern Ireland; they don't pay for water, and that doesn't really work. We have Wales, where it's a not-for-profit company, and that doesn't work. We have Thames Water, and that's not working. Just if I may add to that great question from the student at the front, I quickly looked up Thames Water's bond. It's currently yielding 12%. So you might not like Econ 101, but I can tell you Finance 101, in an advanced economy, if your bond is yielding 12%, you are not going to invest. You are not going to make that hurdle rate unless you're forced to. So I didn't know that fact. That's staggering. We shouldn't be allowing that to happen. Is there a decent proposal to take out the debt and to come up, exactly that first question, with some sort of funding model where the water companies all get funded? Because we can't be paying 12% on what essentially is a company that has state backing.
Okay, great. So we've got downward spiral, we've got the government implemented law, which Kamala will, I presume, will take, and then we've got the bonds question, which dovetails with the first question. Who'd like to take the downward spiral?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we're at risk of being in a downward spiral if we don't get the regulatory settlement that we need for the next 5-year investment program for England and Wales, and that's with Ofwat. So we are very worried about that, and I think it would be fair to conclude that we're at strong risk of a downward spiral if Ofwat doesn't land in the right place. I should say there is an appeal mechanism, so it is possible to have another go with the Competition and Markets Authority. So, but that would cause a delay to investment. So we don't want that. We're hoping Ofwat ends up in the right place. I mean, in terms of special administration and bonds, this has never been used, never once been tested, so none of us know. It's all kind of educated guesses. James thinks it'd be possible to take the shirts off not just the shareholders but also the bondholders. You might be right. I mean, I've seen analysis that suggests that that's not true, but we don't know. We're just guessing. I mean, most of the shareholders of Thames have written down their investments to zero, so they're kind of walked away as it is. The bondholders, however, are still thinking they're going to get, there's some prospect of having their bonds repaid. And they're in two classes A and B, and Class B bondholders are trading at about 20p in the pound right now. So it's not zero, but it's a long way from 1p, 100p in the pound. So this is pretty serious if you're an investor right now. And that is why people who are currently prepared to lend to Thames are demanding extremely high interest rates. But those interest rates are way above what Ofwat builds into its model. So Ofwat doesn't look at every individual company when it's saying how much you can have your bills go up in order to fund the investment. It looks at what it calls the notional company. And there's no such company that in real life resembles the notional company. The notional company is a fantasy, and the notional company is supposed to have borrowing at 55% and have a fully efficient cost base and yada, yada, yada. And because nobody resembles the notional company in real life, including how much it costs to raise debt and how much it costs to raise equity, every company is struggling without, except for a handful, and so that means that Thames is paying a huge price because it has to borrow on those terms, and that's not able to be recouped through the bills because Ofwat's model doesn't allow it to be. So that's a moment. That's a very clear illustration of the stress that the system is in. And even if James is right and all the bondholders get wiped out as well as all the shareholders, then I don't think new people who are going to lend to that entity are going to be lending at anything too far from 12%. Because my God, all these bondholders just got completely wiped out. Goodness me, this supposedly risk-free asset is all of a sudden anything but. And you get a re-rating of the whole system, which is what Moody's and Standard & Poor's and Fitch are saying. Saying, Jesus Christ, this used to be a boring, steady utility. You go in there if you're a pension and you want a small stream of dividends over life. And it's now become much more turbulent, and that means prices go up.
Well, yeah, although if it's under special administration, it's an entirely different circumstance because it's a government-owned entity, and therefore you have the government of the UK that is solid as far as its debt issuance is concerned. So yes, if it continued in the current system, then attracting bond investors may be a challenge, but I'm advocating, as many others are, for a different system with government, at least temporary ownership and a remodelling and looking at it all rapidly under the microscope and making sure that it is attractive to the market, both nationally and internationally. The advice we've been getting from those that we trust and so on. I mean, that might be the right thing, but there are different ways of doing it, and that's why we really need to look abroad. Our very near neighbours, there are so many different ways of cutting it up. Can I also quickly mention that in order for this to work, we could also look at the board structure. So as well as having dirty money replaced with clean money, let's look at who actually sits on the board of these companies. I'm not saying they're bad human beings, don't get me wrong, this is not personal, but who these interests they represent. Are you aware that in Europe there are lots of different water companies that have staff-voted members on the board? They have members of the public as customers on the board. They have members of NGOs and other trusted organisations and so on, all of which has been tried and tested. So the sorts of amendments we're going to be recommending to the Secretary of State very shortly, to the Water Specials Measure Bill, and of course in the review itself, will be along those lines. Look abroad, let's learn from each other, let's see how it can be done in a more equitable way.
And the other two questions, exceptional circumstances. Look, yes, the law is that the CSOs are not supposed to operate unless it's exceptional circumstances and using best technical knowledge, not exceeding excessive costs, wouldn't see it not running, which is a very convoluted legal term, and there's a big debate about exactly what that means. So some people would say exceptional circumstances using best technical knowledge, not exceeding excessive costs, should see overflows operating a handful of times a year. Other people say, one, twice, whereas other people might say 20 or 30. And there have been a couple of cases, but it's still a bit uncertain. The Office of Environmental Protection is looking into this, and we're hoping that they opine very soon. The curious thing about the Office of Environmental Protection is that it's, in a sense, replaced the European Commission after leaving the European Union. And the European Commission could impose, through an infraction proceeding, a fine on a member state. And so the United Kingdom government, if it were found to have infracted European law, would have to cough up money. Under the Office of Environmental Protection, it has the similar power, but ultimately that would be the Treasury paying the Treasury. So it does, and we haven't gone through one of these proceedings yet, so this is all a bit up in the air. But ultimately, that it's slightly a sideshow. Like we don't want CSOs ever to operate. We want them to be zero, and that's going to take a lot of investment. So, where the companies have been at the margins, not having invested enough in the past, and there are cases around this at the moment, and possibly it's true that it hasn't always happened as it should have. The new investment by law can only happen if it's new, necessary, and value for money, as independently attested by Ofwat. So this is, we want this all sorted out. The last thing we want is any dispute about the law. There should be clear agreement about this stuff. But really, we just need to get on and start building massive storage tanks and huge urban drainage systems so that we get less rainwater in the system in the first place. And then I'm afraid that's going to take a lot of money, and that's going to mean all of our bills have to go up modestly. We're talking about sort of 20-30% in real terms over the next 5 years, with huge additional protections for those who will find those rises too difficult to bear.
Do you want to add anything on the legislative thing?
Yeah, I mean, very similar to what you were saying, that we have primary legislation, but we have to have secondary legislation to actually give it effect and make it meaningful. And all of the concerns are that, we have this vague terminology, we don't have clear deadlines and timeframes, and regulatory postponement, and also lack of resources for enforcement. OEP seems to be severely strapped in what it can do just because it doesn't have any money. And, and that is something that, it feeds into the whole system of crisis and the spiraling of what's going on. So you create a new body and you don't give them any money. It just sounds like more of the same stuff, same crap.
Okay.
Let's deal with Richard's question.
Let's take another round a bit.
Oh, okay.
Well, that was partially covered, the bond stuff.
Okay.
Okay, have we got an online question or two? Got one? No.
They were asking about, given water companies are incentivized to have or grow their asset base, are we sure that building like large reservoirs or those large sewers is the best solution? I guess you've already said that it probably isn't.
So incentivized to, what was the...
They've asked, given that water companies are incentivized to grow their asset base, then they're questioning the building of large sewers and reservoirs. Is that the best?
Should we take a couple more from the audience? There's one there and one there. And we're getting close to the end, so we'll be the last three questions. So there's one here. There's two roving mics, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Quinten, master student at LSE, Environmental Economics. I have a question about how we are assessing the impact of bad sewages. Because if we are monitoring most frequently in cities, where less nature is present, aren't we underestimating the impact of bad sewages on the environment, nature, and its services? So also indirect effects, but also for future generations.
Hi, my name's Ken Penton. I'm co-chair of the Labour Party's Environment Campaign. We ran a campaign in the general election with our president, Fergal Sharkey, which probably caused a lot of those 40 seats that David said that changed hands did. So it's online, but it's quite late, so I'll say it was our Stop the Shit Show tour. And that's what the public think the situation, the state of the things are. I've got two questions, really. One is, the review that the Secretary of State has announced that is going to take place. We don't know the detail and the scale of it, but we're going to be pushing for it to be as broad and as wide-ranging as possible, looking at the regulators and the structure of the industry as well. And given that, do the panel think it would make sense to announce a 5-year funding on bills when you haven't decided what the structure of the industry is looking like? So pushing that through and actually wait or delaying it until you've actually got your review, to me, seems much more logical. And then secondly, David, you said, you tried to suggest that 10, 15 years ago things were different, but now everyone's committed to taking things forward. And the regulatory approach has failed, and you want better and stronger regulation. But I mean, are you really telling me that the former owners of some of the water companies, people like Macquarie, for instance, who used to own Thames Water, never lobbied the regulators as well as the government to have took regulation? And of course, Macquarie now own Southern Water as well. So it's not just the past; it's the current and potentially the future if we don't sort this out.
Okay, you can have to ask a quick question. The microphone's coming. So we'll have 4 questions. Ed, you can take your pick because we have 3 answered the previous round, and then we'll go along the panel.
So my name is Sewage. I'm a Year 12 student studying economics at A-level in this first year. And it came apparent to me when you said how our drinking water contains microplastics, hormones, and endocrine disruptors. And I've got a question, which is, do you know the extent that these endocrine disruptors, hormones, and microplastics, do you know the extent that they sort of have on our health, like the effects that they have on our health, and what sort of problems may arise from these microplastics and endocrine disruptors that aren't being treated in our water systems?
Okay, Ed.
Okay, well, I mean, it's difficult for me as a non-expert on all this stuff to answer any of these questions. That being said, so perhaps the kind of closest I get to an answer, which at least provokes some thought, is to your question. I do think that. So our data provision when it comes to some of the impacts is genuinely better. As David was saying, genuinely we collect data that many other countries around the world don't. Many people are only now discovering that a lot of people just don't know where these sewage overflows are. Literally, some pipe was built somewhere going into a river a century ago, and no one has thought about tracking down where it is and trying to find that. So actually, I think we are quite advanced on that in the UK, but I think there's a kind of broader issue, which is that it strikes me there's kind of a deep level of blindness towards our attitude towards water. I mean, sewage is one part of it, but drinking water and just water consumption in general is another. I mean, how much do you think your water consumption is? I mean, what's the average number that we tend to talk about with people in the UK?
About 140 litres per person per day.
So 140 litres per person per day, and that presumably includes your showering, your flushing of your loo, dishwasher, washing machine. That doesn't, I'm pretty sure, I'm saying, include food. And within food, there's such an extraordinary amount of water that's embedded in food. If you're drinking a glass of orange juice, that's about, or rather, a litre of orange juice is, as I understand it, about 90 litres of water in terms of what it takes in the irrigation systems to grow that orange. If you're consuming meat, in particular something like beef, your consumption isn't just a few hundred litres. It's thousands of litres, depending on where that beef comes from. Depending on if that cow was fed with some alfalfa that's been irrigated, if it's on the other side of the world. Now, those kinds of distinctions about just understanding the embedded water within the products and the services that you're consuming is something that is just way off. We're very good at thinking about our carbon footprint. We're still only at the kind of the beginning stages of thinking about our water footprint. And so I think there is quite a lot of learning that we need to do on this. And the irony is, as we get kind of good on the, better on the environmental side of things, on the carbon side of things, we do still seem to have a kind of quite a blindness towards, our water consumption. We're less, and the final thing to say about that, one thing, there's been a lot of pessimism about this so far, but in the UK, actually, if you're eating a beef from the UK, it's considerably lower in terms of its water footprint than eating beef, for instance, from the US, where it's fed on alfalfa that might have come from irrigation, because that's the issue here, it comes from irrigation. Here in the UK, where cows are eating grass, generally speaking, on a meadow that's fed by the water from the rain, that's much less of a water footprint. These are quite interesting, sophisticated considerations, but as far as I can tell, we are so far from actually having that conversation about what our impact is, and we're mostly just thinking about the flush of the loo, rather than thinking about when you drink a cup of coffee, how much water is in there. Answer, a lot. Many, many litres it takes to make that coffee.
Great. So we're a little bit over time, so let's go down the line in this order. And about a minute to pick responses to particularly, well, we kind of got reservoirs and we've got indirect effects, 5-year bill, plastics. So who wants, you go Cameron first.
Well, you know, I look mostly at the enforcement and the kind of regulatory side of it, and it's clear that that is still being developed since 2021, and we're still waiting for it to be fleshed out and to find out actually how meaningful it is. I mean, I suppose this conversation for me is just reinforces this kind of hopelessness that we feel as consumers in this country at the moment about our water and the enormity of the issue. But, you know, I live a lot of the time in the Netherlands, and the bill has just gone up 50%, and you see exactly what they're upgrading the sewage is accepted. It's seen as a very normal thing that you pay for. And in the Netherlands, they've got some of the best water, you know, it's filtered through the dunes and stuff like that. But I have to say, I was surprised that the resource curse has also hit Dutch people, because they use 2.5 times more water than anybody else in Europe, because they thought this is so plentiful and so delicious. So in our minds, we don't think about conserving water in Northern Europe. We just think, oh, there's water everywhere. You go to a hot country in Africa, and you're very, very aware of the water and how, you know, how you can't drink out of the tap. And I think, as you said, like we are blind to the fact we've thought it's so plentiful, especially it rains all the time. What is the problem? It does rain all the time. That is the problem.
David?
Right, so there's a lot in there. I mean, that online question about the regulatory asset base is very astute. That system, all things being equal, does incentivise an ever-increasing asset base because companies want to invest. So this is why we would love to be able to invest like crazy in order to stop the overflows, but there's a limit on, as I explained earlier. I would say, though, that there's a current developments, some in place, some are about to be in place, to incentivise and, in fact, penalise companies if they don't do things, for example, what are called nature-based solutions. So instead of building a lot of concrete and steel tanks, that we have more natural means, like building wetlands and so on, which are better for not just the environment, but so don't result in an increase in the regulatory asset base. This is one of the things that we would love covered in the fundamental review, because the system, the economic regulatory in particular, isn't delivering. I'm not sure whether Macquarie was lobbying or not 15, 20 years ago, I don't know. All I know is if you added up all the dividends that they ever extracted and threw it into the system, you're not going to get to 3/4 of the way of where we need to be in the next 5 years alone. So, you know, there's been bad behaviour in the past, and of course there should be accountability for that. But at the end of the day, this is really pretty small beer compared to what the scale of the challenge. We have immense pressures placed on the network because of climate change and population growth. And it's this idea that we pause bill rises for the next 5 years. I'm afraid we saw a cancer hospital in Cambridge that the Environment Agency formally sought to block for no other reason than a lack of water. And the council took an extremely unusual decision to override that attempted block. That's extraordinary. We're seeing lots and lots and lots of houses around the country. So if we pause investment for the next 5 years, I mean, I know some campaigns have said only essential investment should proceed until this is all sorted out. I mean, like, what's essential? I think that we need to invest today. We should have been investing many years ago, and I think it's folly to suggest that we can afford to wait, because we have really critical needs for the country. I mean, just wait until these data centres come, and the final bit of the planning application is an application from the water company to get the water, and the water company turns them down. Coca-Cola last year tried to build a bottling facility just outside of Cambridgeshire, and it was denied. 1,000 jobs. That is going to become frequent daily news because we're running out of water. Yes, leaks should go down, but ripping up pipes buried well beneath the pavements and roads of central urbanised places like London and Leeds and Birmingham is extremely expensive. I mean, we could get leaks down to zero tomorrow, you know, in due course, if you open up the roads all over the country. So sadly, it is cheaper and will be for time immemorial, I suggest, to treat the water knowing that a portion of it will be reduced through a loss through leaks. So yes, we need to spend more on reducing leaks, but we do, I'm afraid, also need to increase this quantity of supply. And not having built a reservoir in 30 years has been a major impediment. And we need to stop obstructing as much water from chalk streams and all the rest. Microplastics so I was talking about wastewater. Microplastics enter into the system. Wastewater systems try and stop some of it, but we don't have the fourth stage treatment. Drinking water is the other end of the system, and there's extremely high protections in place to ensure that as much of the stuff that we don't want in the drinking water is eradicated, and it's about to be even more. These so-called forever chemicals, PFAS. The Drinking Water Inspectorate has just in the last couple of weeks introduced new standards to increase even further the elimination of those chemicals in our drinking water. So please don't fear about the drinking water. Drinking water is, as I say, universally or annually attested by the World Health Organization and its associated agencies as being the best standard in the world. And I love the idea about a water footprint. All in on that.
Okay.
I think Ken was probably not suggesting waiting another 5 years. Is that right?
Yeah,
a few months. So basically a rapid review, but however long. But the point being, we could possibly put things back a bit, and I would agree with that, Ken. Richard, go back to your point about the different structures that are used in the UK. I would just repeat what I said earlier, and that is those structures cannot work unless we have proper regulation, unless we have benign financial systems. So all of them could work, and in fact do work in other parts of other parts of Europe, although often in a hybridised model. When it comes to water quality, this young man here, then there's research you can look at. If you look at Oxford University, they've done research into the comparisons on impact on wildlife and human health, comparing agricultural pollution and sewage pollution. Have a look at it. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm james@riveractionuk.com, and I can point you towards it. And then finally, if you hadn't heard, there's a March for Clean Water on the 3rd of November at Parliament Square. I will trust you'll all be there. And I mean everybody.
Yeah, I'll be
absolutely
there.
Everybody. And because it is a systemic issue, it's not only sewage, it's also agriculture, road runoff and other things. Our asks are the following. They're very simple. Enforce the law, end pollution for profit, reform the regulators. Who would disagree with that? See
Okay,
you.
thanks. Sorry. Let me just say, I think it's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity for me, and I hope for everybody else. I think, for the fact that nobody's left, I don't think, and we could have carried on speaking and carrying on with discussion for even longer. I think even though we've overrun, kind of reflects some of that. So it'd be great to thank Ed, Kamla, David and James for joining us, and to you, to the audience, and to the online audience for the event tonight. Thanks very much.